Hello, Habitat Gardeners. During the second period of restrictions, the Gardens for Wildlife Guides and I wanted to reach out to you, give you some ideas of what you can do until we can come and visit you again. My name's Belinda. I work for Whitehorse City Council and my role there is to facilitate Gardens for Wildlife. I also sit within the planning department so I can provide advice around tree selection. I really love this photo of our municipality. It was taken from Bellbird Dell, and you can see Box Hill in the middle ground there with the towers starting to come up, and of course the city CBD off in the distance. I think it's a really great perspective to have of our environment because you can look down on our suburbs and think, well, if I was a bird or an insect or a mammal, what opportunities have I got to move around this landscape? What opportunities for habitat are there for me? Why do we garden for local wildlife? I think a lot of people think it's a very people-centered activity. We like to watch the birds, we like to watch the insects, but a study that's come out of RMIT University has found that 30% of threatened species within Australia have part of their habitat in the urban environment. So that means we're actually providing habitat for those organisms that need it the most. And why is this? I think it's because our gardens provide a diversity of elements, different types of plants, sources of water, places to shelter, that really does support a variety of animals. Some of those, the urban adapters. These rainbow lorikeets here are a very common sight in our suburbs. You can hardly walk down the street without seeing a bunch, and yet during the 70s and 80s they were quite rare in a Melbourne context. So why is that? Probably because we've planted plants that suit them, such as nectar-rich grevilleas, and created environments that allow them to stay in Victoria all year round. Crested pigeons and corellas also seem to have increased in numbers in Melbourne suburbs. Again, think about what we've done in our suburbs that support these species. But of course, some species have been less successful in the urban environment. We hear from the community all the time. We just don't see those little insectivorous birds anymore. We'd really love to bring them back. If we think about this eastern yellow robin, it actually nests quite low within dense prickly shrubs. It needs to be able to forage. It needs cover to be able to do that. And it is quite at risk from cats and also from bully birds, which can be just as much of a problem as cats. How have we changed our urban landscape to remove those dense prickly shrubs? We like to have gardens we can look out across where we have a vista. We have actually changed our landscape to favour some of those bully birds, but as habitat gardeners, you can start to reverse that. So Gardens for Wildlife recommends a variety of elements to go into each garden where possible. You can look at it a little bit like a checklist, where you can break up those elements, have a look at your garden, see what you're doing well, see what you could improve. And I'm going to move through these elements one by one now. So most gardens wouldn't have room for a great big beautiful yellow box tree like this. It's providing so much habitat, from the flaky bark that little microbats could get into to the leaves that insects can munch on, and then of course those insectivorous creatures can munch on the insects themselves. But even if you don't have room for a really big canopy tree, we recommend that you have a look at some of the shorter eucalypts that can fit into any urban garden. This is a red-capped gum. It was voted the most popular gum tree last year. And it's one that's come across from western parts of Australia that is quite useful in an urban context. If you're curious about more shorter gums for urban landscapes, have a look at the Melton Botanic Gardens website, and they've got a list with a lot of pictures which might help you to make some choices. We need to have canopy within our gardens for so many reasons. Apart from perching and nesting, which seems pretty obvious, consider the microclimate that a canopy tree brings, not just for animals, but for us as well, in terms of shade and slowing down wind. They also provide organic material in the form of mulch. As leaves and bark falls, you can leave it on the ground and provide habitat at a ground level for invertebrates as well. The shrub layer, so this, as I was saying, is the element that many gardens have lost. We need to try and aim for dense vegetation in that layer, sort of between your knees and your head, if you like, because that's what we've mostly cleared. You want to aim for vegetation that is so thick that you can't even really see through it. Obviously, you might not want to put that vegetation right in front of your front door. It might go down your fence lines or at the back of your garden. Try and create that dense layer using a variety of species so that something might be bearing flowers or bearing seed at different times of the year. Remember to prune vegetation, helps to keep it dense. Wallabies would have performed this function in the past, but now of course we have to do it. And consider how you can connect the canopy, so that tree layer, to the ground using your middle story plants. This is particularly important for fledgling birds that might have come out of the nest, gone down onto the ground, and then need to work out how to get back up through a series of short hops or short flights. Have a look at some of our native acacias as well for prickles. We've got prickly Moses, is a very quick growing dense shrub with little prickles that can provide habitat quite quickly in any garden. Flowering plants are a very important element because they provide a food source for so many birds and insects. Aim for a diversity of colours, forms, levels, flowering times. If you can get something flowering in your garden all the time, that's fantastic. Don't discount introduced plants as a source of flowers, but try and avoid weeds that might become invasive. We've noticed that the salvias seem to be a particular favourite of many of our native pollinators, such as the blue-banded bee. And of course, avoid insecticides around those flowering plants, because then you can impact those animals that we really do want to keep. I think in some regards, seeds and fruit are one of the hardest things to provide in a habitat garden. Many of our local species, such as this gangang here, rely on weedy shrubs, such as this Cotoneaster, as a source of seeds and fruit. And in doing so, in feeding in this way, they actually spread those seeds around. Now, if we were to remove all of the Cotoneasters and hawthorn and boxthorn from our environment, that would be great to get rid of some weeds, but it would mean there'd be a deficit in food for these animals that have come to rely on them. So we need a staged approach over a longer period of time. Prickly currant bush is a really great alternative, but it is very slow growing. So you might actually plant this in the area where your weedy shrubs are and just prune back those branches to let back the light in year after year. As the indigenous shrub grows, you can eventually remove the exotic one. Nodding saltbush is another great source for little berries. It supports skinks at a ground level, but you could also train it up a chicken wire or other type of structural support to give it some height. Allow some grasses to run for seed for seed-eating birds like rosellas. Themida or kangaroo grass is a great one to do this with, as the seeds are quite large, but you might even observe some of these birds coming to weedy seeds as well, such as wild oats. If you've got local birds coming to fruit that you're producing for your own enjoyment, you might need to share. But if you want to keep it all for yourself, you might need to use wildlife safe netting. That's netting that has holes in it that are too small to get your fingers in, and that is kept taut over a frame, maybe a timber frame, or you can use polypipe quite effectively too. The reason for keeping it taut is so that if a bird or a bat comes down to check out your fruit and they land on that net, realize they can't access the fruit, they need to be able to push off and get away from that netting without becoming entangled. It'd be very distressing for you to wake up one day and find that your fruit netting has actually been the cause of a strangulation of a fruit bat. I just want to touch on insects because I think it's something like small birds that anecdotally we're hearing a lot of observations that there's just not as many insects around as there used to be. Think back in the past when you'd go for a drive and squash 100 bugs on the windscreen. Now you can go for a drive and nothing. So where have all of those insects gone? We can provide a role in supporting insect diversity in our garden by providing a range of plants, including ones that provide flowers. Lots of daisies. This Kunzia also with the common brown flowers for a long period and provides lots and lots of food source for things like butterflies. But also think about insects that are feeding on foliage. Having some sacrificial trees, such as silver wattles or Bursarias, is a really good way to provide that foliage. You can buy the trees in tube stock, so there's not too much financial investment, and then keep it cut back low. This stresses the plant and causes it to produce new growth, which seems to be a better food source for leaf-eating insects. Of course, once you've done this, you've damaged the tree. So you need to continue to coppice it until it dies or remove it, because it will never grow into a well-structured tree after that. Tufting grasses can also be really valuable for moth and butterfly larvae. Particularly the wallaby grasses seem to provide an important role in this. And allow the insects to find their own balance. So for example, if you've got a young shrub that seems to be plagued by sawfly larvae or something like that, you might think, well, I think this shrub can survive this attack, so I'm going to let it go, see what happens. If you think you might lose that shrub, you could remove maybe just some of those larvae, leave a few there, and remove them by hand without the use of insecticides. So nesting sites, we all want to see nesting happening in our gardens. And here we've got some examples with a little tawny chick there and the welcome swallow, very different nesting styles. Tawnies will use a messy stick nest, and they often like to have branches that are horizontal and jumbled in amongst each other. So think about next time you might have a tree that needs pruning, if you can retain some of those horizontal branches, even if they're dead, as potential nesting sites. Also think about where stick nesting birds are going to obtain that sticks. Are you leaving sticks around your garden for them to pick up? The welcome swallow is creating a mud nest on the side of a building here, and you can leave fibrous materials such as grass from poas, tussock grasses and things like that in your garden for them to pick up. Also leave spider webs under the eaves during nesting season. It's really great, particularly if they're near your window. You can watch the birds come and collect those spider webs, and they'll incorporate them into their nests for strength. Of course, some of our creatures need hollows to nest in, and there's really not enough hollows in the suburbs anymore because large old trees often pose a safety risk and are removed. So nesting boxes can be used as a substitute, and we can see a galah here in a nesting box. This galah's made some modifications to that entry hole to suit it better. If you're going to install a nesting box, there's a couple of things that you really need to think about. First of all, how are you going to get the nesting box up into the tree? It's a great idea to hire someone who's very good at ladders to do that. And how are you going to attach the nesting box to the tree without causing it damage? Generally, it's better to use a long bolt or a deep screw into the tree rather than a band around the tree that will eventually cause some problems as the tree's girth increases. It's not very good for the tree. Also try and avoid having bark collect under that nesting box. You also need to think about thermoregulation for that nesting box. Some of them do tend to have a tendency to heat up, so try and place the nesting box on the shady side of the tree and avoid the afternoon sun. If you can, you could consider sending a climber up that tree as well to help provide extra shade for the nesting box and also obscure it a little bit from predators. You need to think about if you are sending a climber up though, if that's going to have a negative impact on the health of the tree. You might find your nesting box becomes invaded by bees or common miners as well. So you need to have a plan in place for what you'll do if that eventuates, because you have a bit of a responsibility to deal with those pests if they do move in. Another option would be to consider a chainsaw hollow. So if you've got a large gum tree that you're having pruned by a professional arborist, you could ask that arborist if that would be a potential tree to have a chainsaw hollow cut into. Particularly if you've got a dead section of the tree, an arborist might be able to pop a hollow in there while not affecting the living part of the tree. But it will very much depend on the nuances and the shape of your gum tree. And think about how you're going to monitor these spaces. We really need to know, who's using the boxes, what shaped hollows and what shaped boxes are best. There's quite a bit of literature out there, and it'd be great if you could add your observations to that collective knowledge. Probably the easiest thing to do to support wildlife in your garden is to add a source of water. Try and look at options for adding water at different heights, so at a ground level, deep in prickly shrubs, and out in the open. Depending on the different species, you'll be able to cater to their preferences for drinking. It's really important to make sure that any water that you add is not a potential drowning risk. Many people buy glazed bowls, such as this one in the picture. It's fine for these gangs, but if an insect landed in that water with the surface tension, it would be quite hard for it to escape. Fortunately, this one has a stick in it, so the insect would be able to swim around in a circle until it comes across that stick and then break the surface tension and walk out. Even frogs can drown in glazed bowls if there's not an exit point like this. So it's quite important to think about. Also, make sure you keep the water clean. This is particularly important for water sources that are provided for birds because of beak and feather disease. And frog bogs. We really don't have enough habitat for frogs in our urban environment. This is because one of the first things that early white settlers did in Australia was to remove these boggy wet areas and make the land more usable for grazing and orcharding. But now we have a role being able to pop them back. Frogs do not particularly do well in running water, so frog bogs and soaks and ponds are very important for them to be able to breed. Make sure that the water has a number of layers. So we need deeper areas that helps to keep the water from heating up in summer. And we need to have shallower areas that allow for the growth of algae, which is what the tadpoles will be feeding on. Having layers also helps the adult frogs to move in and out of the pond. You can also use things like bricks and logs and rocks to help change those layers if you buy a pond container or a fixed plastic container that you're setting into the ground. You need to take out any goldfish, but the problem with that is that, of course, when you first establish that frog pond, you're going to get mosquito larvae. Let them find their balance. Once the dragonfly and damselflies move in, and they can do that very quickly if you have other ponds nearby to your place, the larvae of the dragonflies will actually eat the mosquito larvae, and then you won't have to worry about them anymore. But it is a little period at the beginning of when you establish that pond. Somehow the mosquitoes find it before the dragonflies. So you might want to think about establishing your pond over winter when you might not be out and about so much and bothered by those mosquitoes. Logs and rocks are one of the garden elements that really helps to support lizards like the skink, also things like blue tongues and geckos. Don't remove logs from the bush, they're needed in the bush, but woody weeds can be a good source of logs, or if you have a friend that's having a tree removed, you can ask them to keep some logs aside for you. It's particularly good if those logs are hollow. Place the logs in under tussocks. Think about how those animals might want to move between areas of foraging for food and areas of sheltering. And be prepared that any logs that you pop in your garden will eventually rot out. This is a good thing because it means that decomposing organisms will move in, which are a part of the food chain. Things can come and eat them, but it does mean that you will need to replenish those logs over time. Mulch is such an important element of a habitat garden because it provides a layer or a habitat niche all of its own. And all of those critters that live within the mulch then of course are food for other organisms. So wherever you have space in your garden to replenish the mulch, it's such a good idea to do so. Try to access Yuki mulch if you can. This is essentially just chipped up bits of trees that tree loppers will actually have as a byproduct, so it doesn't cost too much. And avoid getting those bags of woody mulch that you might get from a shop where it's all the same size. It's better to have a variety of organic material within the mulch rather than it all being the same size, because that way it will break down more gradually. So the leaves will break down first, and then the barky bits, and then finally the woody bits. Allow plants within your garden to contribute to natural mulch. So eucalypts that are shedding their bark, don't see that as a waste product, see that as free mulch, and allow it to stay where it is or spread it over areas that need more mulch. You'll find that very quickly after mulching your garden, insects will move into that space and provide lots and lots of food source for those insectivorous birds that we're after. Just a word on weeds. This can be a really daunting thing for a lot of habitat gardeners because it can be hard to tell which are the weeds and which are the good guys. So just start to be aware of the changes in your garden, things that are appearing that might have been dispersed through the wind or might have been dispersed by birds. And of course, ask if you're not sure. So this capeweed up the top here, this is going to produce a lot of seed that will spread far and wide. It looks very pretty though, so a lot of people allow it to stay in their garden without realising the impact that it can have. The mirror bush too down the bottom here is one that is bird dispersed. So you might find you've never had it in your garden before, and then all of a sudden it will pop up as a little seedling. It's very easy to remove, but as it starts to form a small tree, it becomes more and more difficult. So keep an eye out and try and get these seedlings before they become a problem. Some weeds will really require you to battle it out for a long time. Things like soursop takes many, many years to bring under control. So don't give up, but do a little bit of homework and find out what is the best time of year to attack a particular weed. That way you're going to get the most sort of bang for your buck, if you like, in terms of the effort that you're putting in. Also be aware of things like some of the daisies. If they've started to run to seed and you're then going through thinking, oh, I've just noticed that it did have a flower, but now it has seed, I'm going to start to pull them all out. You're going to create soil disturbance right at the time that that plant is releasing its seeds. It's kind of a waste of time. You might as well just leave it there. Leave the soil profile intact and then see how many actually come up next year. Pull them out before they go to seed. Prioritize. If something is in your garden that's providing a bit of habitat and it's not likely to escape, why worry about it? But if something might escape, particularly if you're near a bushland reserve, then it becomes a little bit more of a priority and you might want to deal with it more quickly. So it's about being smart and really thinking about where your effort will best be placed. So we're just going to have a little look at an example. This is a garden in Box Hill, and you might want to go through this process with your garden. Just step outside, have a little look around, go through that checklist, see what you're doing well and what areas you could improve. So with this garden, obviously we've got a canopy heading up there, which is fantastic. And I can see along the back fence too, there's a lot of dense shrubs and several different species there, which is fantastic. So over time, that will continue to grow up and obscure the fence and provide a corridor for those small birds. Might want to give those a little clip back every now and again to encourage density. I can see that there's lots of places for skinks to go, which is great, but I can't see any sources of water. So it might be an idea to put a source of water perhaps down low under those rushes at the front there, maybe another source of water near the back, near the shrubs, maybe even hanging from a tree so that a cat can't access it. I also can't see any plants that are in flower at the moment. I mean, there's lots of flowering plants in that shot, but maybe there's nothing that's flowering in this space at the moment. So I might try and add a little bit of diversity to my flowering species and just make sure that I'm catering to those insects that are after flowers at this time of year. And there seems to be a little bit of soursop, that bright green in the middle there. So I might very carefully see if I can dig some of that out before those bulbils underneath the soil reproduce. But overall, this would be a big pat on the back. Doing really well, and keep going. So Greenlink and Bungaluk, which are two volunteer-run Indigenous nurseries, have remained open during the COVID period, but with some modifications in place to protect the staff. So they're running on a lower number of staff and they're not taking cash payments. So what you might like to do is have a look at their websites, give them an email, see what they've got in stock. They might be able to put a box of things together for you that you can do like a sort of a version of click and collect, I suppose. And you might be able to get some plants in the ground this season. Greenlink and Bungaluk are both staffed by volunteers. It really does keep the cost of the plants down, and you might be able to find the voucher as well on your Whitehorse calendar. That will keep the cost down even more. The staff at both of these nurseries can provide you excellent advice. So if you do get a chance to meet them and have a quick chat, you could bring photos from your garden. If there's things that you're not quite sure what they are, if you've got a gap and you'd like a suggestion, you can come to us. You can also come to them. Record your observations as you go. So this is an image of a little frog that's curled up in this dead leaf here. And if I wasn't sure what that was, I could actually tap into the iNaturalist platform. I could upload that photo and naturalists all across the world might give me some ideas of which species they think it is. And when that's confirmed, then that record of that frog being in that location will be there for future naturalists, both professional and amateur. It's a really great way to learn. It's a really great way to contribute to the collective knowledge. You might also like to take part in other citizen science projects such as the Wild Pollinator Count or Birds in Backyards. The more information we can get about the species that are out there in our urban environments, the better we can manage them. And share your observations with your neighbours. It's a great way to boost community enthusiasm for what you're trying to do. So for more information, if you get to the library, A.B. Bishop's book Habitat is a fantastic resource, as is the Sustainable Gardening Australia website. Greenlink and Bungaluk Nurseries, as I mentioned, the staff there, it's just amazing what they know. Such a great resource, as is your local parks friends groups. Visits are off at the moment, but you might be able to connect with them. Working bees are off at the moment, but you might be able to connect with them when we're able to go back to doing working bees again. Also have a look at Council's website. On the Gardens for Wildlife page, we've got a series of fact sheets that you can download from the thumbnails. I've just put 3 up above there, and they might give you some species specific information to get you going. Or email me. I can answer your questions or put you in touch with our garden guides. We can't do visits at the moment, but we're all out here and we're really keen to help you where we can. So you can send some photos through if you'd like to have a conversation or a Zoom meeting with the guides. We can set that up for you as well. We'd really like to be able to get you going in the garden during this period, because winter and early spring, such wonderful times to get out there and make some habitat changes. Few additional links there for you if you wanted to do a little bit of further reading. But thank you so much for your interest. Please feel free to get in touch with us. Not just me, but all of the garden guides wish you well in your garden, and we're looking forward to getting back to those garden visits as soon as it's safe to do so. Thanks so much for listening.